In the early hours of December 21st, 1944, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe stood in the frozen basement of his command post in Bastogne, Belgium, watching the German Panzer divisions move into position around the town. The 101st Airborne Division, along with other scattered American units, was now completely surrounded by 3 German divisions. It was a situation that seemed desperate. The Germans, with their fast-moving tanks and overwhelming artillery, were in full control of the surrounding terrain. The town of Bastogne, located at a vital crossroads where 7 major roads converged, was critical to the Germans' offensive. If they could capture the town and its road network, they could continue their push westward, threatening to sever the Allied supply lines and halt the advance of American forces in Europe. McAuliffe had just assumed command of the 101st Airborne Division under some of the most challenging conditions imaginable. The division was deeply entrenched in the town and surrounded on all sides by enemy forces. Bastogne was the center of a crucial defensive position, and its loss would be devastating to the Allied forces. Yet, McAuliffe's orders were clear: hold Bastogne at all costs. The German strategy, part of the larger Ardennes offensive, also known as the Battle of the Bulge, had initially been very successful. The Germans had broken through the American lines in the Ardennes forest on December 16th, catching the Allied forces off guard. The Germans, hoping to drive a wedge between the American and British forces, had advanced rapidly, forcing American troops into a retreat. The 101st Airborne Division had been hastily brought in to hold the crossroads town of Bastogne, with orders to hold it at all costs despite having insufficient winter clothing, limited ammunition, and no clear intelligence on the strength of the German forces closing in around them. The strategic importance of Bastogne had been recognized by both the Germans and the Americans. The Germans understood that controlling the town would allow them to secure the roadways and continue their westward march, potentially reaching the critical port city of Antwerp. For the Americans, holding Bastogne was just as important. It was a key position in the German advance, and its capture would allow the Germans to push deeper into Allied territory. When McAuliffe arrived in Bastogne on December 19th, the situation was grim. The 101st Airborne Division had already been in combat for several days and was stretched thin. The town was surrounded, and communications were cut off. American forces had no way of knowing when or if reinforcements would arrive. The nearest Allied forces were 60 kilometers away, engaged in a fierce fight to break through German lines. McAuliffe, as the artillery commander, had been placed in command only by default. Major General Maxwell Taylor, the division commander, was in Washington, attending a conference, and the assistant division commander, Brigadier General Gerald Higgins, was in England. With no clear leadership structure, the responsibility fell to McAuliffe, who now had to make critical decisions for the survival of the division. McAuliffe's arrival in Bastogne was not under ideal conditions. The weather was brutally cold, with temperatures dropping well below freezing, and the men of the 101st were not prepared for winter combat. Most were lacking proper cold weather gear and had been forced to wear makeshift clothing taken from casualties and civilians. Many were suffering from frostbite and exhaustion, and morale was low. The division had already taken heavy casualties in the fighting around the town, and had little to show for it except a determination to hold on. The town itself had been heavily shelled, with buildings reduced to rubble, and the surrounding terrain was hostile. The Germans, with their armour and artillery, had the clear advantage. But McAuliffe knew something that the Germans did not. While surrounded, the defenders of Bastogne held the critical crossroads that the Germans needed. The town was a strategic bottleneck in their offensive. If the Germans succeeded in taking Bastogne, they could use it as a springboard to continue their push west. However, McAuliffe realized that, by holding the town, the Americans could slow down the Germans and buy precious time for reinforcements to arrive. The first thing McAuliffe had to assess was the position of his forces. The 101st Airborne Division was divided into several regimental and battalion-sized elements, each holding different sectors of the perimeter. The 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Julian Uhler, held the eastern perimeter. The 56th Infantry Regiment, led by Colonel Robert Sink, held the northeastern section, while the 5002nd Parachute Infantry Regiment, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Steve Chapui, defended the northwestern part of the town. The 327th Glider Infantry Regiment, under Colonel Joseph Harper, held the southernmost and most vulnerable portion of the perimeter, which stretched across open terrain. Behind these frontline units was the division's artillery, including 3 battalions of 155mm howitzers, commanded by Colonel Thomas Sherburne. These artillery pieces would be the backbone of the defence, providing heavy fire support to the defenders. McAuliffe knew that artillery would be critical in stopping any German attempts to break through, especially since the Germans would have to attack in predictable ways, following the road networks. The next critical step was organising the defence. McAuliffe had limited manpower and resources, but he understood that the key to holding Bastogne was not just to survive, it was to destroy as much of the German attacking force as possible. By concentrating fire on predictable German avenues of approach, McAuliffe hoped to make every attack costly for the Germans. The key to success, McAuliffe realised, was in not trying to hold every inch of ground. The defenders could give up parts of the town temporarily, but they had to hold the crossroads and key strongpoints. They could channel the Germans into killing zones areas where their tanks and infantry could be destroyed by American artillery and anti-tank guns. This was a strategy of attrition, not simply holding out until help arrived, but instead drawing the Germans into a battle they could not afford to fight. Every tank and every infantryman the Germans lost would be one less they could use to push their offensive forward. The German forces, under General Heinrich von Luttwitz of the 47th Panzer Corps, wasted no time in closing the noose around Bastogne. They launched their first assault on December 20th, attacking the American defences from all directions. The Germans had the advantage in numbers, and their artillery began to pound the American positions heavily. They hoped that with sufficient pressure, the Americans would eventually crack, surrender, or be forced to retreat. For the first 2 days of the siege, the Germans focused on probing the American defences, searching for weak spots. They attacked with infantry and tanks, using their heavy artillery to soften up American positions before sending in their infantry to overrun them. But the Americans held firm. Despite the overwhelming pressure, McAuliffe's plan to concentrate his forces at key points and use artillery effectively paid off. The German attacks, while initially intense, were stymied by the disciplined defence of the 101st. It quickly became clear to the Germans that Bastogne would not fall quickly. And so, on December 22nd, 1944, they sent a message to McAuliffe demanding that he surrender. The Germans, confident in their superiority, thought the Americans had no chance of holding out. They offered honourable surrender terms, expecting McAuliffe to capitulate. But when McAuliffe received the German demand for surrender, his response would change the course of the battle and become one of the most famous moments of the war. McAuliffe's response to the German demand was swift and unequivocal: nuts. When his staff officers asked for clarification, McAuliffe explained, "I mean nuts, tell them to go to hell. We're not surrendering." This single word, simple yet defiant, would become a symbol of the 101st's determination. McAuliffe's refusal to surrender, despite the dire circumstances, emboldened his troops. The Germans, bewildered by such an answer, were forced to continue their assault, knowing that the Americans would not give up. McAuliffe's response had a profound effect on the morale of his men. The men of the 101st knew that their commander had made a stand, refusing to surrender to the Germans despite being surrounded and outnumbered. The decision to hold Bastogne was no longer just a tactical necessity. It had become a statement of American resolve. And while the situation was far from secure, McAuliffe's defiance gave his troops a renewed sense of purpose. They would fight on, no matter the cost. In the days that followed, the battle for Bastogne would continue to rage, but McAuliffe and his men had shown the world that they would not be easily defeated. The Germans had underestimated the determination of the 101st, and they would soon learn just how costly their mistake had been. By the 17th of December 1944, the German forces had launched their massive Ardennes offensive, codenamed Wacht am Rhein, or Watch on the Rhine, with the aim of breaking through the Allied lines, capturing critical supply routes, and seizing the port city of Antwerp. The German army, under Hitler's orders, threw its remaining reserves into one last desperate attempt to turn the tide of the war on the Western Front. The offensive aimed to split the Allied forces in half, creating chaos in their lines and buying the Germans more time to regroup. The American forces facing the brunt of the assault were stretched thin. The primary goal of the German offensive was to seize the critical road junctions that would allow them to drive west toward the Meuse River and Antwerp, cutting off Allied supply lines and effectively separating the American and British forces. Bastogne, a small town in Belgium, was at the heart of these vital road networks. The Germans knew they needed to capture Bastogne in order to maintain their momentum toward the west. But by December 19th, Bastogne had become a fortress under the command of Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, and the Germans were forced to surround it, hoping to starve and force the Americans into surrender. The German strategy was initially promising. Their attack, launched on December 16th, achieved complete surprise. The 1st SS Panzer Division and the 2nd Panzer Division spearheaded the assault, smashing through the thinly held American defenses in the Ardennes forest. American forces were taken off guard, with units retreating in disarray. The 106th Infantry Division, a relatively green division, was positioned along the Schnee-Eifel Ridge, a key defensive line along the German border. This division would become the first casualty of the German breakthrough. On the morning of December 16th, the Germans unleashed a massive artillery barrage, 1,600 guns firing simultaneously. This bombardment pounded American positions, softening them up for the main thrust of the German tanks. The 106th Infantry Division, ill-prepared for such a fierce attack, was quickly overrun. The division found itself surrounded, with thousands of soldiers being taken prisoner, many without ever having fired a shot in defense. Nearly 8,000 men from the 106th Infantry Division surrendered, marking the largest mass surrender of American troops in Europe during the entire war. The Germans had achieved an early and devastating success, ripping a hole in the American lines. Meanwhile, other American divisions were struggling to hold their ground. The 28th Infantry Division, positioned in the town of Clairvaux, put up a brave resistance against the German 2nd Panzer Division, which included 120 tanks. The 28th fought building to building for 2 days. It was a bitter, bloody battle that ultimately led to the loss of Clairvaux and the destruction of the 28th's defensive positions. The Germans now had clear passage to Bastogne. As the Germans pushed westward, the American defense began to crumble. The 106th and the 28th Divisions had both been overwhelmed, their lines shattered. McAuliffe, still en route to Bastogne from his position in France, received reports about the disintegration of American defenses and the rapid German advance. The situation seemed dire. The German spearheads were moving fast, and American units were either retreating or getting surrounded. By December 18th, the Germans were moving with such speed that the American leadership was forced to consider the worst. The entire American defense in the Ardennes might collapse if the Germans weren't stopped soon. McAuliffe, now commanding the 101st Airborne Division, understood the urgency of the situation. The 101st had been rushed into action without proper winter clothing or enough supplies, and the men were exhausted. They were being sent to a town that was already surrounded by the enemy. Their objective was clear: hold Bastogne at all costs, prevent the Germans from advancing, and delay them long enough for reinforcements to break through. But that was easier said than done. On December 18th, McAuliffe received orders from Major General Troy Middleton, the commander of the 8th Corps, to move his division into Bastogne. The 101st, known for its elite status as an airborne division, had earned a reputation for toughness and bravery. But the situation they were about to walk into was unprecedented, with the enemy already so close, and the Germans' massive advantage in armour and artillery meant that holding the town would require more than just bravery, it would require strategic brilliance. By December 19th, the 101st arrived in Bastogne, and McAuliffe held a meeting with Middleton. Middleton's staff was already burning documents and preparing to evacuate, knowing the situation had deteriorated beyond belief. The German forces were on the move, and Bastogne was about to be completely surrounded. McAuliffe, however, was resolved. Despite the odds, he knew the importance of Bastogne not just for the survival of his men, but for the future of the entire Western Front. The Germans had to be stopped here, at all costs. At this meeting, Middleton told McAuliffe that the situation was rapidly becoming untenable. German forces were closing in from all directions. It was only a matter of hours, maybe a day, before Bastogne was entirely surrounded. There would be no reinforcements for the foreseeable future, and McAuliffe's task was to hold Bastogne long enough for help to arrive, no matter what. McAuliffe, understanding the strategic importance of Bastogne, was resolute. The 101st would hold the town at all costs, even if it meant being surrounded. The mission was clear: delay the Germans, hold the crossroads, and wait for reinforcements to break through. The next day, December 20th, the Germans completed their encirclement of the town. The ring was not perfect. It was not a smooth, circular encirclement. Instead, it stretched over about 26 kilometers of terrain, and it followed natural features like roads, villages, and woods, with the German forces spread out in sectors. Within these sectors, the Germans had placed infantry, armour, and artillery ready to strike at the American defences. The perimeter was a mixture of tough terrain, urban areas, and open fields, all of which would be tested in the coming days. By now, McAuliffe was fully aware of the grim reality. His men were trapped in Bastogne, with the enemy closing in from all directions. But despite being outnumbered 5-1, with little food, no winter gear, and minimal supplies, McAuliffe began to see the situation in a different light. He realized that the Germans had made a crucial tactical mistake. They had surrounded Bastogne instead of bypassing it. The German tanks and infantry were concentrated around the town, which would allow the defenders to focus their firepower on a smaller number of targets. The Americans would be able to use their limited artillery and anti-tank weapons effectively, knowing exactly where the German attacks would come from. The Germans, meanwhile, would have to attack the town directly, wasting precious time and resources, all the while leaving their flanks exposed. As the siege continued, McAuliffe's resolve never wavered. His focus was not just on surviving, but on making the Germans pay dearly for every inch of ground they took. The defenders of Bastogne would hold on, despite being undersupplied, undermanned, and under-equipped. And in the weeks to come, this desperate defense would become one of the most iconic stories of World War II, turning what appeared to be an impending disaster into a decisive turning point in the war. The German offensive, which had seemed unstoppable just days before, would begin to falter, and Bastogne would prove to be the key to its undoing. By December 19th, 1944, Brigadier General Anthony McCauliffe had arrived in Bastogne and taken full command of the 101st Airborne Division. He had been thrust into this role due to the absence of the division's original commanders and the dire situation on the ground. With the town surrounded and German forces closing in on all sides, McCauliffe's leadership was tested in ways he could not have imagined when he had been assigned to the 101st months earlier. The first thing McCauliffe realized was the absolute importance of Bastogne. This was not just another town. It was the vital crossroads of the Ardennes, where 7 major roads converged, and whoever controlled Bastogne controlled access to these critical routes. For the Germans, Bastogne was a key objective in their advance toward Antwerp and the Meuse River, and they could not afford to bypass it. The town's capture would provide the Germans with the mobility they needed to cut off the Allied forces and delay their reinforcements. For the Americans, holding Bastogne was essential. If they lost the town, it would open the door for the Germans to drive even deeper into Belgium, further complicating the Allied defensive efforts. Upon his arrival, McCauliffe was greeted with a chaotic scene. The 101st was spread thin. Many units had been isolated in various parts of the town, and the fighting was already fierce. The troops were exhausted, cold, and low on supplies, with no proper winter clothing to protect them from the freezing temperatures. The Germans had effectively cut off all supply lines, and the men had little food, ammunition, or medical supplies. The situation was dire. And yet McCauliffe, a career artillery officer with little infantry command experience, immediately understood something that would shape the course of the next few days. Getting surrounded wasn't necessarily a disaster. It could actually be the key to victory. When Major General Troy Middleton, commander of the 8th Corps, briefed McCauliffe about the situation, he was blunt. The Germans had surrounded Bastogne completely. The perimeter was not circular, but it was strong and stretched over 26 kilometers, following the natural contours of the land. The German forces were organized into multiple divisions, Panzers, Volksgrenadiers, and artillery, ensuring that they could apply pressure from all directions. Middleton's final words to McCauliffe were chilling. "Don't worry about getting surrounded. If they surround you, you'll have them right where you want them." Oh, at the time, McCauliffe dismissed these words as optimistic command talk. The idea of being surrounded by one of the most powerful armies in the world seemed like an insurmountable obstacle, but as the hours went by and he surveyed the terrain, McCauliffe started to reconsider Middleton's words. It began to dawn on him that the very thing that seemed like a fatal mistake, being encircled, might actually be a golden opportunity. The key to McCauliffe's realization lay in understanding the Germans' tactics. The German army, particularly the Panzer divisions, relied heavily on speed and mobility. Their tanks and infantry were designed to move quickly, bypassing enemy positions and cutting off their lines of communication. If they could bypass Bastogne and move on toward their ultimate objectives, Antwerp and the Meuse River, they could continue the offensive. But the Germans' need for Bastogne's road network was crucial. Without those roads, their entire offensive would slow to a halt. McCauliffe quickly understood that by holding Bastogne, he could force the Germans to commit resources that they could not afford to lose. Every German tank, every division surrounding Bastogne, was one less division that could continue its advance. McCauliffe began to see that the Germans had made a strategic blunder by surrounding the town instead of bypassing it. They had effectively fixed themselves in place around an American force that was prepared to fight from prepared positions. Bastogne was an ideal location for a defense. The town itself sat on high ground, and the surrounding terrain, with its roads and forests, offered opportunities to create kill zones where the German forces could be destroyed in detail. The key was to not try to hold every inch of the town, but to concentrate forces at the most critical points. McAuliffe knew that if the Germans could be funneled into these kill zones, the firepower of the 101st, combined with artillery support, would inflict severe losses on them. The Germans had to attack down narrow roads, which would limit their ability to maneuver their armour and concentrate their forces effectively. McAuliffe's strategy began to take shape. He would hold Bastogne, not just to survive, but to drain the Germans' resources. By keeping the Germans fixed in place, he could destroy their tanks and infantry and prevent them from advancing. Every hour they spent attacking Bastogne was an hour they were not moving toward their main objective. This was a battle of attrition, one that McAuliffe intended to win. McAuliffe gathered his commanders and laid out the plan. He explained that Bastogne was not just a town, it was the key to the entire German strategy. The Germans needed the roads running through Bastogne to move their troops and supplies. They would try to break through the American lines to clear the way, but McAuliffe would ensure that they couldn't. He knew that the Germans had to attack in a fixed direction, and the Americans would be waiting for them, ready to destroy them with artillery, anti-tank weapons, and coordinated infantry assaults. It wasn't just a defensive battle, though. McAuliffe's plan was designed to force the Germans into a series of attacks that would bleed them dry. The defenders would allow the Germans to advance up the roads, but when they got too close, they would unleash concentrated fire from prearranged positions. The goal was to inflict maximum casualties on the Germans while holding the town as long as possible. McAuliffe understood that the longer he could delay the Germans, the better the chances that reinforcements would be able to break through the encirclement. On the evening of December 20th, the Germans delivered an ultimatum. A white flag was raised, and German officers approached the American lines with a demand for surrender. The message was clear. The Americans were surrounded, outnumbered, and running low on supplies. The Germans gave McAuliffe 2 hours to respond. Their message was filled with the expectation that the Americans would recognize the hopelessness of their situation and agree to a dignified surrender. When the surrender demand reached McAuliffe's command post, he read it and asked for advice from his staff. His operations officer, Lieutenant Colonel Harry Card, was taken aback and asked McAuliffe what his response would be. Without hesitation, McAuliffe responded, "Nuts." His simple, defiant reply became legendary. It was the quintessential American response, unyielding and resolute in the face of overwhelming odds. The Germans, baffled by the one-word response, had no idea how to interpret it. McAuliffe's staff had to explain to the German officers that nuts was equivalent to telling them to go to hell. The Germans were furious and would have to continue the siege. But McAuliffe's reply had done something important. It gave his men a clear signal of their commander's confidence and determination. It was a message that no matter how dire the situation seemed, the 101st would not surrender. The German forces, now committed to taking Bastogne by force, began their attacks in earnest. On December 21st, the first assault came, and the American defenders held firm. Each German attack was met with fierce resistance, and while the Americans were suffering casualties, they were inflicting far heavier losses on the Germans. The Germans quickly realized that they had underestimated the resolve of the Americans and that Bastogne would not fall easily. McAuliffe knew that time was on his side. Every failed German attack would weaken their forces further. The longer they stayed in Bastogne, the more their offensive would stall. And if the Americans could hold out long enough, reinforcements would eventually arrive to break the siege. The Germans had made a costly mistake by concentrating so many resources on Bastogne resources that were now being destroyed. McAuliffe's decision to stay and fight, to turn being surrounded into an advantage, would have far-reaching consequences. The battle for Bastogne, which seemed hopeless at first, would become one of the turning points of the Battle of the Bulge. The Americans, led by McAuliffe's clear-headed leadership, were holding the Germans at bay, and every day they held out was a victory in itself. As the days passed and the siege wore on, McAuliffe's belief in his plan only strengthened. He knew that Bastogne was not just a battle for a town, it was a battle for the fate of the entire Allied offensive in the West. The longer the 101st could hold out, the greater the chance of breaking the German offensive once and for all. As December 21st, 1944 unfolded, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe and the men under his command in Bastogne were preparing for the storm that was about to hit them. The town had been surrounded for nearly 2 days, and German forces were closing in, poised to strike at the heart of the American defenses. The situation was precarious, but McAuliffe's strategy, though born of necessity, was beginning to take shape and would soon prove decisive. It was clear that the Germans were not merely surrounding Bastogne, they were going to attack it directly, hoping to overwhelm the defenders with their superior numbers and firepower. The question now was whether the Americans could hold out long enough to force the Germans into a costly and futile battle that would bleed them dry. McAuliffe's task was to organize the defense of Bastogne and prepare his men for what was expected to be a brutal siege. Despite being surrounded by German forces, he knew that his position offered a few key advantages. The town was located at a critical crossroads, and the roads around it formed vital arteries for the German offensive. By holding Bastogne, McAuliffe and his men could deny the Germans these essential routes. The German forces, in particular the Panzer divisions, relied on speed and mobility, and they needed the town to maintain their momentum. If they could be stalled here, it would delay their entire offensive in the Ardennes. McAuliffe's defense plan was centered around the principle of defending from prepared positions. His forces would not attempt to hold every inch of ground. Instead, they would concentrate their defense around key points, vital intersections, and roads that would allow them to funnel the Germans into kill zones. The idea was to give up ground in a controlled manner, drawing the Germans in while minimizing casualties. The defenders would then strike back with concentrated fire from artillery and anti-tank weapons. In order to implement this strategy effectively, McAuliffe needed to position his forces in the most advantageous way. He turned to his commanders for help, each of whom had to defend a section of the town and its outskirts. The 101st Airborne Division was not the only American force in Bastogne. McAuliffe had received reinforcements from the 10th Armored Division, but these forces were limited and scattered. The defense would rely on the combined efforts of infantry, artillery, and armored units. The key to success would be coordination, making sure that each unit understood its role, knew its position, and could react swiftly to changing circumstances. Lieutenant Colonel Julian Oulay's 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment was given the responsibility of holding the eastern perimeter, stretching from the railroad near Luzery southeast to Marvi. Meanwhile, Colonel Robert Sink's 56th Infantry Regiment would defend the northeastern section of the perimeter, from the railroad to the town of Foy. These positions were critical, as the Germans were expected to advance from the east and northeast. The 5002nd Parachute Infantry Regiment, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Steve Chapuis, was tasked with holding the northwestern sector of the perimeter, stretching from Foy to Hemrul. Finally, the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment, commanded by Colonel Joseph Harper, would hold the longest and thinnest section, running from the 5002nd's left flank all the way around to Marvi in the south. This sector would be the most challenging to defend, as it was the largest and most vulnerable to German penetration. Behind these frontline units, McAuliffe positioned 3 battalions of 155mm howitzers, commanded by Colonel Thomas Sherburne. These artillery units would be the backbone of the defense, capable of delivering devastating fire support on the advancing German forces. The artillery was pre-registered on all likely German approaches, meaning that when the Germans attacked, the artillery would be able to target them with pinpoint accuracy, hitting the same spots repeatedly to maximize casualties and destroy German vehicles. Additionally, McAuliffe placed the remaining armored forces from Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division in reserve. These tanks, which had been battered during the early stages of the battle, would remain centrally located, ready to respond quickly to any breakthrough attempts by the Germans. The idea was that the tanks could be used as a mobile reserve, reinforcing any sector that needed extra support. On December 20th, as the last positions were being set up, the Germans began their first serious attempts to break through the American lines. The 26th Volksgrenadier Division, part of the German 47th Panzer Corps, was the first to engage in force, pushing toward the American perimeter in the south. The Germans probed for weaknesses, sending smaller units to test the defenses and gauge American strength. These initial attacks were met with heavy resistance, but they were only a prelude to the main assault that would come the next day. At 1,500 hours on December 20th, the first major German attack came. A company of infantry, supported by tanks, advanced up the road from the south, aiming to breach the line held by the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment. The Americans had prepared their positions carefully, using the natural features of the town and surrounding terrain to create strong defensive points. The defenders let the Germans advance up the road, allowing them to come within 200 meters before opening fire with machine guns, mortars, and rifles. The result was devastating. The German infantry was decimated in a matter of minutes, and the tanks, which had tried to push through, were knocked out by American anti-tank guns. The Germans pulled back in confusion, leaving behind 32 dead bodies and 3 destroyed tanks. American casualties were remarkably light, only 3 wounded, 1 seriously. The attack, although small in scale, was a significant victory for McAuliffe and his men. It demonstrated that the Germans were not invincible, and it sent a clear message that Bastogne would not be easily taken. However, the Germans were undeterred. They had the advantage in numbers and were determined to break the American will to fight. The next attack came at 1,730 hours, a much heavier assault. 2 companies of German infantry, this time supported by 6 Mark V Panzer tanks, advanced toward the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment's positions near Neufchâteau, just to the southeast of Bastogne. The German tanks made it within 150 meters of the American lines before American tank destroyers from the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion, the M18 Hellcats, opened fire. The result was immediate and decisive. 3 German tanks were destroyed in under a minute, and the remaining tanks and infantry quickly retreated, leaving behind 80 German soldiers dead. Despite this setback, the Germans were not giving up. They continued to hammer away at the American lines, probing for weak spots and attempting to break through. Each time, they were met with heavy fire, and each time, the American defenders grew more confident. The Germans' inability to break the American lines so far had a crucial psychological impact. McAuliffe's men were beginning to see that, despite the overwhelming odds, they were capable of stopping the Germans. The first few days of the siege were grueling. The Americans were running low on supplies, with rationing in place and ammunition becoming scarce. The cold was unbearable, and many men had to make do with whatever clothing they could scavenge from dead comrades or civilians who had fled the town. Medical supplies were nearly gone, and the wounded could not receive proper treatment for their injuries. Yet, despite the hardships, McAuliffe's leadership and the soldiers' determination were beginning to turn the tide. The Germans, for all their power, had underestimated the resilience of the American defenders. Each failed attack not only depleted German forces, but also hardened the resolve of the 101st. They knew the importance of holding Bastogne, their survival depended on it. And every day they held, they knew they were weakening the Germans' ability to continue their offensive. For McAuliffe, the key to holding the town was not just tactical brilliance, but maintaining the morale of his troops. The defense of Bastogne had to become a symbol of American determination, a message that, no matter the odds, the Americans would not surrender. As the German attacks continued, McAuliffe's resolve only grew stronger. Holding Bastogne was no longer just about surviving. It was about ensuring that the Germans would pay dearly for every inch of ground they took. The battle for Bastogne had only just begun, and already McAuliffe's leadership and the steadfastness of his men were transforming it into one of the most iconic moments in World War II. By December 22nd, 1944, the siege of Bastogne had been in full force for 3 days, and the situation was dire. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe and his forces had held off several German attacks, but the 101st Airborne Division, along with the scattered units from the 10th Armoured Division and other support troops, were exhausted, low on supplies, and severely outnumbered. The German forces had fully surrounded the town, and it appeared that the Americans had no choice but to surrender or face annihilation. What happened next, however, would make the Battle of Bastogne one of the most iconic moments in military history. At approximately 1,100 hours on December 22nd, a small group of German officers, under a white flag, approached the American lines in the southern sector of Bastogne. They carried a message from the German commander, General Heinrich von Luttwitz, the head of the 47th Panzer Corps, who had been leading the effort to capture the town. The officers were escorted to McAuliffe's command post, where they delivered the German ultimatum. The German message was simple and blunt. The American forces in Bastogne were surrounded, outnumbered, and out of supply. They were to surrender, and the Germans offered honorable terms, meaning that the American soldiers would be treated as prisoners of war, with the promise of fair treatment. The Germans made it clear that the Americans had no chance of breaking out, and that further resistance would only result in unnecessary bloodshed. The message read in part, "The fortune of war is changing. This is the German commander speaking. The fortune of war has placed your command in the position of being encircled. There is only one possibility. The honorable thing for you to do is to surrender. You will be treated well. We will not harm you, but if you continue to resist, we will annihilate you." The German officers then gave McAuliffe a deadline of 2 hours to respond. To anyone familiar with military history, this was a typical strategy. Isolate a force it into surrender by presenting an ultimatum, and then use the threat of total destruction to convince the enemy to lay down their arms. The Germans likely believed that the Americans, being completely surrounded and facing such overwhelming odds, would quickly give in to their demand. But McAuliffe was not so easily intimidated. After reading the message, he was left with a choice. His forces, though brave, were running low on ammunition, food, and medical supplies. The cold was brutal, and many soldiers had no winter clothing. The roads to Bastogne were cut off, and no reinforcements were expected for days, if at all. The Germans were bringing more firepower to bear, and it seemed that surrender was the only reasonable option. However, McAuliffe's instincts as a leader kicked in. He had been thrust into a leadership position under difficult circumstances, and the men under his command looked to him for guidance. McAuliffe knew that surrender would not only be a blow to the morale of his troops, but would also be a victory for the Germans, giving them a significant psychological boost. More than that, surrendering would mean giving up the town that was the key to the German offensive in the Ardennes. The deadline for surrender loomed, and McAuliffe had to make a decision. His immediate response, one that would become legendary, was simple: nuts. The word was not only a reflection of McAuliffe's refusal to submit to the Germans, but also a message to his troops that he would not give up no matter how grim the situation looked. He was sending a message of defiance to the Germans and reinforcing the morale of the soldiers who were fighting in the freezing cold, under dire circumstances, and against overwhelming odds. Upon hearing McAuliffe's response, his staff was stunned, as they had expected a more conventional answer to the German ultimatum. Lieutenant Colonel Harry Card, McAuliffe's operations officer, asked for clarification, to which McAuliffe replied, "I mean nuts. Tell them to go to hell. We're not surrendering." The staff, though initially confused by the brevity and clarity of McAuliffe's response, quickly understood the significance of his words. It was, in a sense, a rallying cry. McAuliffe was not just rejecting the Germans' demand, but was reaffirming the resolve of every soldier in Bastogne. The refusal was definitive, and it sent a clear message. The 101st Airborne would fight to the last man if necessary, but it would not surrender. The German officers, who had initially expected the Americans to capitulate, were left bewildered. The word nuts was a response they could not understand, and it left them confused and frustrated. They requested an explanation, and the American officers escorting them back to the German lines told them, in no uncertain terms, that it meant go to hell. The Germans, realizing that they had not been successful in forcing a surrender, were forced to retreat to their lines and prepare for the next phase of their assault on Bastogne. McAuliffe's one-word reply was more than just a tactical decision. It was a statement of defiance that would resonate far beyond the walls of Bastogne. The word nuts quickly spread through the ranks of the 101st, and it became a symbol of their determination to hold out against the odds. For the soldiers in the trenches, the response lifted their spirits, giving them the strength to keep fighting despite their dire circumstances. The Germans, for all their superior numbers and firepower, were now facing a force determined to hold Bastogne at all costs. The psychological impact of McAuliffe's reply on the German commanders was profound. General von Lüttwitz and his superiors had assumed that the encirclement would cause the American forces to collapse. Instead, they were met with an unflinching response. McAuliffe had shown the Germans that Bastogne would not fall easily, and that they would have to commit even more resources to take the town. This would cost the Germans dearly, both in terms of men and material, and would set the stage for the eventual collapse of their offensive. Meanwhile, McAuliffe's decision to refuse surrender had a broader impact on the Allied war effort. The Battle of Bastogne was not just about holding a town, it was about maintaining the momentum of the American and Allied forces in Europe. McAuliffe's defiance would prove to be a key turning point in the Battle of the Bulge. As the days passed and the Germans continued their failed attempts to break the American defenses, the Allies were able to regroup and counterattack. After receiving McAuliffe's answer, the Germans had no choice but to continue their assault on Bastogne. The Panzer divisions began concentrating their forces in preparation for a full-scale attack on the American positions. They had hoped that a surrender would allow them to avoid a bloody battle, but now they were committed to taking the town by force. However, with each failed assault, the German forces were being drained of precious resources. By the time Christmas Eve arrived, the Germans had committed 3 divisions to the siege of Bastogne, but the Americans continued to hold strong. Despite the lack of supplies, the 101st remained defiant. The morale boost from McAuliffe's response had solidified the determination of the defenders. For McAuliffe, the battle was far from over, but the refusal to surrender had set the stage for the next phase of the battle, holding out long enough for reinforcements to arrive and for the Germans to exhaust themselves against prepared defences. McAuliffe's response, while simple, was a turning point not only in the Battle of Bastogne but in the larger context of the Battle of the Bulge. The Germans, who had once thought victory was within their grasp, were now stuck in a battle of attrition that they could not afford. And McAuliffe, with his bold leadership, had turned what seemed like a hopeless situation into an opportunity for ultimate success. As the siege of Bastogne continued, McAuliffe's resolve, and the resolve of the men under his command, would be tested in ways few could imagine. But by refusing to surrender and issuing his now legendary response, McAuliffe had already won an important victory. He had given his men the will to keep fighting, and he had ensured that Bastogne would not fall without a fight. By December 23, 1944, the defenders of Bastogne had endured almost a week of continuous German attacks. The situation had reached a critical point. The German forces were heavily entrenched around the town, with infantry, artillery, and armour concentrated from all sides. Bastogne's defenders, including the 101st Airborne Division, Combat Command B of the 10th Armoured Division, and attached artillery and engineer units, were holding their ground against overwhelming odds. But their situation was dire. Ammunition was running low, food was scarce, medical supplies were exhausted, and the men were exhausted from days of constant fighting in brutal winter conditions. The Germans, under the command of General von Lüttwitz, had committed several divisions to the siege. They hoped that by squeezing the defenders into a corner, they could force a surrender or eliminate them as a threat to the German offensive. The German strategy was working, but the Americans had proven to be more resilient than the Germans had anticipated. McAuliffe's refusal to surrender had galvanized the defenders, and despite the hardships, the American forces held on. But even McAuliffe and his men knew that holding out for much longer without outside assistance was not an option. The town of Bastogne, sitting at a critical crossroads, was vitally important to the Germans' broader offensive plan. But it was equally important to the Allies, and McAuliffe's forces were the only thing standing between the Germans and their objective. With German forces entrenched on all sides, the question was not just about survival, but about whether reinforcements could break through and relieve the town before the situation became untenable. As the days passed and Christmas approached, McAuliffe and his commanders could only hope for one thing: air support. The weather conditions had been severe, and the American Air Force had been grounded by snow, clouds, and fog for much of the siege. However, by December 23rd, the weather began to clear, and for the first time in several days, Allied aircraft were able to make their way into the area. This would prove to be a game-changer for the beleaguered defenders of Bastogne. At around 1,300 hours on December 23rd, McAuliffe received news that a massive resupply operation was underway. The 101st had been running on empty for days, with no food, ammunition, or medical supplies to speak of. The artillery had been firing at a reduced rate, and infantry units had resorted to using their rifles only sparingly to conserve ammunition. The shortage of medical supplies had taken a heavy toll, with wounded soldiers receiving little or no treatment. Without supplies or reinforcements, it seemed as if the siege would soon lead to disaster. But this was not to be the case. The resupply operation was massive, involving 241 C-47 aircraft, known as the Skytrains, flying low over the surrounded town. The planes were filled with 144 tons of supplies, ammunition, food, medical supplies, and most importantly, fresh rations for the starving men on the front lines. The bundles of supplies were dropped from the sky by parachute, each one marked with coloured indicators so that they could be identified from the ground. As the planes began their runs, the skies were filled with parachutes descending to the ground, each one carrying critical supplies. The American defenders, who had been living off minimal rations and were subsisting mostly on field rations, watched in awe as the resupply operation unfolded. Each bundle that fell represented hope that the siege could be broken and that their survival was still possible. The C-47 seconds were escorted by P-47 Thunderbolt fighter aircraft, ensuring that the planes could operate in relative safety from German aircraft. The first drop was incredibly successful. While some of the bundles landed outside the perimeter and into German hands, the majority fell within the American lines. The 101st soldiers eagerly rushed to collect the supplies, replenishing their dwindling ammunition stores and finally receiving the food and medical supplies that had been lacking for days. The artillery units, now fully stocked with shells, were able to ramp up their fire once again. The infantry, who had been conserving ammunition in fear of running out, were now able to resume full combat operations. For the men of the 101st, this moment was a critical turning point. Their morale had been suffering under the weight of constant bombardment and the cold, harsh conditions. But the resupply brought a sense of hope and purpose. The Germans, who had expected to break the defenders' will through attrition, now realized that their chances of quickly overcoming the town had been diminished. Bastogne was no longer a starving, isolated garrison on the brink of collapse. It was a fortified stronghold, resupplied and ready to continue the fight. The success of the resupply operation was followed by another critical advantage for the defenders: air support. With the skies clearing on December 23rd, American fighter bombers were able to conduct close air support missions. The 10th Armored Division's tanks, still holding the town, were bolstered by the presence of P-47 Thunderbolt fighters, which began flying sorties to attack German positions. The P-47 seconds were a formidable force. With their powerful engines and heavy armament, the Thunderbolts were perfectly suited for close air support, strafing German tanks, trucks, and infantry. The planes would dive low to the ground, dropping bombs and firing rockets at the German lines. The air superiority provided by the Allies meant that the Germans were now vulnerable to attacks from above, something they could not easily counter, given the state of the Luftwaffe by December 1944. The German forces, who had initially expected to break the American lines quickly, were now in a precarious position. Their tanks, many of which had been painted for summer operations, stood out starkly against the snow-covered terrain of Bastogne. The P-47 seconds were able to target them with precision, knocking out tank after tank. German infantry and supply vehicles, which were already struggling to move through the snowy, muddy conditions, became easy targets for the American planes. The air support also helped to demoralize the German troops. They had already suffered heavy casualties from American artillery and infantry fire. Now, they faced the added threat of American planes that seemed to be everywhere, making it nearly impossible to move without fear of being strafed or bombed. This had a profound psychological impact on the German soldiers, who began to question the effectiveness of their assault. The battle was no longer simply about ground combat. It was a battle of attrition, with the Germans losing precious tanks, men, and morale with every failed attack. For the American forces, the combined effect of the resupply operation and air support was a massive morale boost. The realization that they were no longer isolated, and that the Germans could no longer operate freely in the area, gave the 101st a renewed sense of purpose. They now knew that the siege would not break them, not yet. They had the supplies, they had the air support, and they had the artillery and infantry to keep fighting. The successful resupply and the introduction of air support had a devastating effect on the German offensive. By December 23rd, the Germans had committed large portions of their forces to the siege of Bastogne. They had initially planned to take the town quickly and then continue their march westward. But now, as their armoured divisions stalled under heavy resistance, their fuel reserves dwindled, and their ability to continue their advance was compromised. The German commanders, led by General von Lüttwitz, were forced to divert even more resources to the siege. They attempted to break through the American lines multiple times, but each assault was met with fierce resistance from the 101st and the other units holding the perimeter. The Germans had already lost several tanks and vehicles in earlier attacks, and now the air support was making it even harder for them to operate. By December 25th, the Germans had exhausted many of their options. The American resistance at Bastogne had succeeded in its primary objective, to delay the German advance and force them to commit more resources than they could afford. The Germans were now stuck in a battle of attrition, facing an enemy that refused to give up. Their offensive, which had seemed unstoppable just a week earlier, was grinding to a halt. The impact of the resupply operation and air support could not be overstated. It was a turning point in the Battle of Bastogne and in the larger Battle of the Bulge. The Germans had lost their momentum, and the Americans, reinvigorated by the supplies and the psychological boost of air superiority, were now in a position to continue holding the town and force the Germans into retreat. For the defenders of Bastogne, December 23rd was a day of renewed hope. They had held out against overwhelming odds, and now, with the aid of air power and critical supplies, they could fight back more effectively. The Germans, who had once believed Bastogne would fall easily, were beginning to realize that the American forces were not going to give up the town without a brutal and costly fight. By December 25, 1944, the defenders of Bastogne had already withstood nearly a week of fierce German assaults. The men of the 101st Airborne, along with the scattered units from the 10th Armored Division and the 327th Glider Infantry, had been living through unimaginable conditions, freezing temperatures, minimal food, a constant barrage of German artillery, and relentless attacks from all sides. But despite the dire situation, the resolve of the American forces had only strengthened. Thanks to the critical resupply operation, air support, and their unwavering determination, the defenders had been able to hold the line. The German offensive, which had started with overwhelming momentum, was now faltering. The attackers, once confident that they could crush the American defenses in Bastogne within a matter of days, were finding themselves bogged down. The American forces had fortified their positions, and the harsh winter conditions had further hampered the Germans' ability to sustain an effective assault. The heavy losses in men and material were beginning to weigh on the German commanders. Every failed attack only made it harder for them to maintain their offensive. On Christmas morning, the Germans launched their most serious attempt yet to break through the American lines. At 0330 hours, the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division, freshly committed to the battle, and elements of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division began an assault against the American positions along the western perimeter of Bastogne. The Germans were attempting to strike at the villages of Hemrul and Shams, which were held by the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment, part of the 101st Airborne Division. The goal was to breach the American defenses and make a push for the town centre, cutting off vital roads and inflicting serious damage to the defenders. The initial German attack was launched under the cover of darkness. The element of surprise caught some of the American defenders off guard, but the Germans quickly found that the American positions were more resilient than they had anticipated. The 327th, despite being outnumbered, fought fiercely. The German infantry, supported by tanks, penetrated part of the American line but were quickly repelled by American infantry and tank destroyers, including M18 Hellcats, which were stationed in depth. The Germans were not able to capitalize on their initial success. While they had achieved surprise, they were unable to coordinate effectively or maintain the momentum of their advance. As daylight broke and the American artillery began to fire in full force, the German attackers found themselves caught in a crossfire. The tanks that had penetrated the line were exposed to concentrated anti-tank fire from multiple directions. American artillery, having been resupplied just days before, was able to deliver precise barrages on German positions. The P-47 Thunderbolts, which had been providing close air support for days, returned to attack German positions on the ground. Tanks, trucks, and infantry were destroyed by bombs and strafing runs from the air, severely hindering the German ability to continue their assault. By 0800 hours, the German assault had stalled. Despite the initial surprise, the German forces could not make significant headway into the American defenses. The 327th Glider Infantry, reinforced by artillery and air support, had successfully repelled the German push. The German tanks that had breached the line were either destroyed or forced to retreat, and the infantry was driven back. The German casualties were heavy. Approximately 1,500 men were killed or wounded, and 18 tanks were destroyed or abandoned. The Americans suffered around 300 casualties, a painful toll but far less than the Germans. The defeat of the German assault on Christmas morning marked a critical turning point in the siege of Bastogne. The German forces, which had been confident in their ability to break through, were now realizing that the Americans would not give up the town easily. Their attacks had failed repeatedly, and each attempt to breach the American lines only resulted in more losses. The once vaunted Panzer divisions, which had been feared throughout Europe, were now bogged down in a battle of attrition that they could not afford. This failure on Christmas Day also had a profound psychological impact on the German troops. Many had been hoping for a swift victory, a chance to demonstrate their strength. Instead, they found themselves entrenched in the snow, facing an enemy that was well prepared, well supplied, and resolute in their determination to hold Bastogne at all costs. The morale of the German troops began to erode as they faced mounting casualties without making any progress. For the 101st and their supporting units, however, Christmas Day brought a sense of victory and renewed determination. The ability to hold their positions against such fierce and repeated German attacks was a testament to their resilience. McAuliffe's decision to refuse the German surrender offer, coupled with the effective use of air support, artillery, and the resupply operation, had transformed the situation from one of imminent collapse into one of mounting success. The battle for Bastogne was no longer about merely surviving. It was about inflicting heavy losses on the Germans and ensuring that their offensive could not continue. While the Germans were struggling to make headway in Bastogne, the larger picture of the Battle of the Bulge was beginning to shift. The breakthrough that the Germans had hoped for had failed to materialize. The Germans had concentrated their forces around Bastogne, believing it would be the key to their success. Instead, they had trapped themselves in a battle that drained their resources, time, and manpower. Every day they spent attacking the town was one less day they could use to push toward their ultimate objective, the Meuse River and the city of Antwerp. By the time Christmas Day came to a close, the Germans were no closer to taking Bastogne than they had been the day before. Worse, they had lost key armoured units, tanks, and infantry that would be impossible to replace. The failure of their Christmas assault signified the beginning of the end for the German offensive in the Ardennes. The concentration of forces around Bastogne had weakened the Germans' ability to continue their advance elsewhere, and now they were facing a situation where every additional day spent on the siege was a day wasted in their larger offensive. As the Germans continued their failed assault on Bastogne, American reinforcements were finally able to break through the German lines. General George Patton's Third Army, which had been racing to relieve Bastogne, succeeded in breaking through the German positions south of the town. On December 26th, at 1,650 hours, Lieutenant Charles Boggs of the 37th Tank Battalion, part of Patton's forces, made contact with the defenders. The siege was officially broken. For the men in Bastogne, the relief was nothing short of miraculous. After 8 days of continuous fighting, surrounded and under constant attack, the soldiers of the 101st Airborne, along with the other units holding the town, were finally able to breathe a sigh of relief. McAuliffe and his staff received the news with a sense of both joy and disbelief. The siege had been broken, and the German forces, who had spent so much effort surrounding Bastogne, were now being pushed back. The relief of Bastogne was not the end of the battle, but it marked a significant turning point. The Germans had failed to achieve their objective of capturing the town, and their offensive was now in disarray. The loss of Bastogne, along with the depletion of their Panzer divisions, meant that the Germans no longer had the ability to continue their push westward. The Battle of the Bulge, which had seemed to be on the verge of turning the tide in favour of the Germans, was now a decisive Allied victory. The relief of Bastogne was a pivotal moment in World War II. It symbolized not just the resilience of the American soldiers, but also the failure of the German offensive in the West. The Battle of the Bulge would continue for weeks, but the Germans had lost their momentum. Bastogne had become a rallying point for the Allies, a testament to the courage, determination, and leadership that turned what seemed like a desperate situation into a resounding victory. McCaffrey and the men of the 101st would forever be remembered for their heroic stand in Bastogne. The refusal to surrender, the successful defense of the town, and the eventual relief by Patton's forces would go down in history as one of the greatest examples of American military tenacity. And for the Germans, the loss at Bastogne marked the beginning of the end of their last major offensive in the West. From that point on, the Allies would continue their advance toward Germany, with the German army in full retreat. Bastogne had become the turning point that broke the back of the German offensive in the Ardennes and set the stage for the eventual Allied victory in Europe. By December 26, 1944, the siege of Bastogne had been broken, and the German offensive in the Ardennes, once a bold and promising attempt to turn the tide of war, was beginning to unravel. The Americans had managed to hold their ground in the face of overwhelming odds, and with General George Patton's Third Army breaking through to relieve the town, the strategic implications of the battle were profound. Bastogne, once surrounded and seemingly on the verge of collapse, had become a symbol of the resilience and determination of the Allied forces. The impact of the failure at Bastogne on the German offensive cannot be overstated. The Germans had launched Operation Wacht am Rhein, the Ardennes offensive, on December 16, 1944, hoping to achieve a decisive breakthrough and force the Allies into a negotiated peace. The idea was to split the American and British forces in half by capturing key crossroads towns like Bastogne, which would disrupt the Allied supply lines and delay reinforcements. The Germans aimed to drive through Belgium and capture the port of Antwerp, which was vital to the Allied war effort. However, by the time the siege of Bastogne was broken, their timetable had already been severely disrupted. The German army, which had committed nearly 400,000 men, 24 divisions, and over 1,000 tanks to the offensive, was now facing catastrophic losses. The fighting at Bastogne had drained critical resources, including the panzers, infantry, and artillery that were meant to spearhead the advance. Instead of breaking through the American defenses, the Germans had found themselves bogged down in a fierce battle with no strategic advantage. The loss of Bastogne was symbolic in many ways. It had been the critical junction of the entire German plan. The Germans had hoped that taking the town would allow them to maintain their momentum and control the road network, which was vital to moving their forces forward. Instead, their failure to capture the town, combined with the depletion of their resources, crippled their ability to advance further. Bastogne had effectively become the tomb of the German offensive. The German forces that had surrounded Bastogne were now exhausted and demoralized. With their ability to coordinate and communicate fractured, the Germans were forced to divert additional resources away from their primary objectives to continue their futile siege of the town. Their armored divisions, already stretched thin, were unable to make significant progress, and by Christmas Day, the morale of the German troops had been significantly affected. What had seemed like a promising advance had quickly turned into a disastrous stalemate, with the Germans losing men, tanks, and the initiative. The real turning point in the Battle of Bastogne came on December 26, when Patton's Third Army made contact with the defenders. Patton had been moving his forces rapidly to relieve Bastogne, and despite the brutal winter conditions and the difficulties of navigating through enemy territory, he had kept his forces moving. His success in breaking through the German lines was a testament to his leadership and the ability of his troops to execute complex maneuvers under pressure. The breakthrough came at 1,650 hours, when the 37th Tank Battalion of the 4th Armoured Division, part of Patton's Third Army, reached the outskirts of Bastogne. The American defenders, who had been holding on for days, finally received the long-awaited news that relief was on the way. The siege was officially broken. The arrival of Patton's forces was a massive psychological blow to the Germans. After nearly a week of trying to force an American surrender, the Germans were confronted with the reality that their siege of Bastogne had failed. The 101st Airborne, under McAuliffe's leadership, had withstood everything the Germans could throw at them, and now the cavalry had arrived to relieve them. The American forces, despite being outnumbered and under-equipped, had held on long enough to turn the tide. For the defenders of Bastogne, the relief was nothing short of miraculous. The psychological weight of the siege had been lifted, and the men who had been struggling to survive now felt the joy of victory. The air was filled with cheers as they saw American tanks and infantry break through the German lines. For the soldiers who had endured the freezing cold, starvation rations, and constant bombardment, the sight of American reinforcements was a moment of triumph. The relief of Bastogne was not just a victory for the 101st Airborne or the Third Army, it was a turning point in the Battle of the Bulge, and, by extension, the war itself. The failure of the German offensive, particularly in the Ardennes, marked the end of Germany's ability to mount effective offensives on the Western Front. The resources they had expended at Bastogne and elsewhere could not be replaced, and the losses in men and material were irreparable. The relief of Bastogne was a critical moment because it exposed the limits of the German strategy. The Germans had planned to divide and isolate the Allies, using speed and surprise to knock out critical towns and cities. But Bastogne, which had initially seemed to be a simple target, had turned into a formidable defensive stronghold. The Germans had underestimated the tenacity of the American defenders and the effectiveness of their logistical and air support. McAuliffe's refusal to surrender, coupled with the successful resupply and the eventual arrival of Patton's forces, had disrupted the German timetable. The German forces had not only failed to capture Bastogne, but had also suffered devastating losses in the process. The American resistance had inflicted a toll on the Germans that they could not recover from. The loss of Bastogne, along with the continued Allied resistance throughout the Bulge, made it clear that Germany could no longer sustain its offensive in the West. The Germans had failed to achieve their primary objective, and the momentum of their offensive had completely stalled. The Allies, now bolstered by Patton's forces, were able to launch counter-offensives that would push the Germans back and begin the long road to victory in Europe. After the relief of Bastogne, the fighting in the Ardennes continued for several weeks, but the Germans were on the defensive. The American forces, having successfully broken the siege, began to push the Germans back, using their advantage in air support, artillery, and manpower. The Germans were no longer able to mount the kind of large-scale offensive they had begun in mid-December. Their Panzer divisions had been severely depleted, and the losses in tanks, men, and equipment were irreplaceable. As the weather improved in early 1945, American air superiority played a crucial role in further breaking the German forces. The P-47 Thunderbolts, which had been crucial during the battle, continued to attack German supply lines, tanks, and infantry, further hindering their ability to regroup. American forces, led by General Patton, launched their own counterattacks, eventually forcing the Germans to retreat. The Battle of the Bulge, which had begun as a desperate German offensive to regain the initiative in the West, ultimately ended in failure. The Germans lost tens of thousands of men. hundreds of tanks, and precious time. Time they could ill afford as the Allies prepared for their final push into Germany. The battle had drained German reserves and weakened their ability to defend against the inevitable Allied advance. The defense of Bastogne and its subsequent relief became one of the most iconic moments of World War II. McAuliffe's leadership, the bravery of the 101st Airborne, and the support of Patton's Third Army turned what seemed like an impending disaster into a resounding victory. The battle showed the power of holding critical terrain, the importance of air and artillery support, and the unwavering determination of soldiers in the face of overwhelming adversity. Bastogne's legacy is one of resilience in the face of hardship, of courage when the odds seemed insurmountable. The men who fought there, both in the defense and in the relief, became legends. The American victory at Bastogne turned the tide in the Ardennes and was a key factor in the final collapse of Nazi Germany. The defenders of Bastogne, led by General McAuliffe, had not only held the line but had dealt a death blow to the German offensive in the west. In the weeks and months that followed, the Allies would push into Germany, and by May 1945, the war in Europe would come to a close. Bastogne had been one of the pivotal moments that made that victory possible.